Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Adult Autism, a Spectrum of Uniqueness podcast. I'm Chris Quarto. Today we're bringing one final case before the Autism Myth Court. And as I was thinking about this episode, it occurred to me that all of us make assumptions every day. And, if someone smiles at us, we assume what? They're friendly. If someone looks upset, we assume something happened. If someone walks into a room wearing a white coat with a stethoscope around their neck, what do you assume? Yeah, that they're a nurse or a doctor. Now, most of the time we do pretty well with those quick judgments, but sometimes they don't serve us well. And that's especially true when we're trying to understand another person. Well, today's myth may actually explain why so many of the other myths we've talked about in this series have been around for so long. The charge before the court today is this: you can tell whether someone is autistic just by looking at them. Now, if the prosecution were making its case, I think it would begin with something we've all heard before. Come on, you can usually tell. And maybe it's because someone doesn't make much eye contact or they seem awkward when you talk to them and they're stimming the whole time. Well, over time, people begin to associate those characteristics with autism. Here's the problem, though. Once we have a picture in our minds of what autism is supposed to look like, we naturally begin comparing everyone else to that picture. And that's where things can start to go off track. Think about it for a sec. What's your image of an autistic person? Is it Ray Babbitt? You remember the guy in the movie Rain Man? Maybe it's Sheldon Cooper in The Big Bang Theory, or Sam Gardner if you've watched that Netflix series Atypical. Now, let's hear from the defense. One of the things that's changed my own thinking over the years is realizing how often I was meeting autistic adults who really didn't fit the picture most people carry around in their heads. Like I've had teachers and engineers, homeless people, construction workers come in for psychological evaluations, people from all walks of life. And it started to get a little confusing when some of them said they loved being around people or considered themselves to be empathetic because it didn't go along with the picture in my head as to what autistic people were like or were supposed to be like, whatever that is. And in fact, the more evaluations I completed, the less confident I became that autism had a particular, look to it. It reminded me of something we sometimes do in psychology. Once we learn about a condition, we can become so focused on looking for certain characteristics to confirm what we think is going on that we overlook or maybe discount everything that doesn't fit our expectations. So I started thinking a little differently about this. Instead of asking myself, does this person look autistic? I started asking, what has this person's experience of the world been like? See how one question focuses on appearances and the other one focuses on understanding? I want to call a witness to the stand now, and it's one that comes up in almost every evaluation I do. It's called masking. Here's the simplest way I can describe it. I think you know what this is, but masking is basically presenting yourself in a way that you think other people will find acceptable. I mean, that's a real basic description of it. And many of you probably know what I'm talking about because you do this yourself. Things like making eye contact, even when it's uncomfortable. Have you ever rehearsed small talk before you meet with someone? Or how about copying facial expressions you've watched other people use? The important thing is that most people don't see any of that effort. They just see someone making eye contact or carrying on a conversation and assume that that's who the person naturally is. And that's exactly the point. If the only evidence the prosecution can offer is what a person looks like from the outside, masking alone should be enough to get the case thrown out, right? Because the entire skill being described is the skill of not looking a certain way. I've sat across from adults in my office who spent years masking so well that not even the people closest to them had any idea what it was doing to them, what it was costing them. Some of them didn't get evaluated until their 30s and 40s, and it's kind of an interesting thing. I see the same thing happening with autism as I did with ADHD in the past. 30 years ago, when I evaluated kids for ADHD, it never failed to amaze me how one of the parents would say, uh, that sounds just like me when I was a kid, when we were reviewing the test results for them. And I'm seeing this happen with autism nowadays. Many parents with autistic kids are realizing that, that saying, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. They're realizing this, and they're deciding to get themselves evaluated for autism. And that's really my point. If autism had an obvious look, people wouldn't reach adulthood, sometimes well into adulthood, without anyone recognizing it. Now, here's another witness worth calling: gender. For decades, a lot of the research and the diagnostic criteria were built around observations of whom? Young boys, which meant an entire generation of autistic girls and women grew up not fitting the mold that the field had created. And it wasn't because they weren't autistic. It was because the mold didn't fit them to begin with. Now, culture is another one. The way things like eye contact, tone of voice, or physical closeness get interpreted, that differs from one culture to another, which means the same behavior can be read as perfectly typical in one setting and seen as unusual in another. And then there's age. An autistic adult who spent 30 years in the workforce may have developed scripts and strategies that someone who's just entering adulthood hasn't had time to develop yet. And put all that together, and you start to see the problem with the prosecution's whole argument. It's not just that autism is hidden sometimes. It's that there was never one single way for autism to look in the first place. And that brings us back to Stephen Shore's famous quote. You may have heard this. If you've met one person with autism, what? You've met one person with autism. Now, I want to be fair to the prosecution here because there's a kernel of truth buried in the myth. Therapists are trained to notice certain patterns, like certain differences in how people communicate or certain types of repetitive movements, or maybe the way a person talks about a topic they're interested in. Those things can be important pieces of information, but noticing those patterns during a structured clinical interview, that's a lot different from just glancing at someone across a room and deciding you've got them figured out. The first thing is an assessment, and the other thing is just you're kind of making an assumption about a person. And the danger of this myth isn't really that people believe they can spot autism. The danger is what happens to the person when we get it wrong, when us who are making those assumptions get it wrong. Now, this works in the opposite way too. Consider the person who doesn't get taken seriously by a doctor because they didn't seem autistic or look autistic, or the employee who gets written off as difficult because no one was looking for anything else. That's the real cost of this myth. Someone who really is autistic may never get the understanding, the support, or answers they need because people were looking for the wrong picture. So, before I tell you where the court lands on this myth, let me do a little commercial break. If you've listened to this podcast for a while, you probably remember that I developed an online course for autistic adults called Unmasked Living Authentically as an Autistic Adult. It's a practical 6-week, 14-hour hybrid course, meaning that some of the activities are completed online and the other part involves live Zoom calls with me and fellow students, which is actually what students say they like the most about the course. And the idea is to have more of a psychoeducational approach to helping autistic adults better understand themselves, to be able to help them build healthier relationships and hopefully create a life that truly fits for them. I'm enrolling students now for my next class, which starts the week of August 31st, 2026, which is right around Labor Day. But you don't have to worry about it if you have plans for that weekend because the course is so flexible, it won't interfere with any of your activities. Anyway, I'm only allowing 8 students in the course, and I only have 4 spots left. And I need to know by August 1st, which today, as I'm making this podcast episode, is July 13th. So a couple of weeks, I'm going to need to know. And if you want more information, just shoot an email to me at chris@chrisquarto.com, and I'll send you an informational brochure. I'll see if I can attach it to the show notes here too. Okay, back to the episode. The charge was that you can tell whether someone is autistic just by looking at them. And you know what? I don't think that holds up. Not because appearances don't tell us anything, but because autism was never a look to begin with. It's more about the difference in how someone experiences and processes the world. And that can show up in 1,000 different combinations of a person's traits, their coping strategies, their life experiences, most of which happen kind of beneath the surface where you can't see that stuff. So the verdict, the myth is false. And in a lot of ways, I think this myth has been sitting underneath all the other myths we've been talking about in this series. Once we convince ourselves that autism has one particular look or one particular way of showing up, it's easy for all kinds of other misconceptions to kind of, grow out from there, which brings us to the end of this particular series. We spent 5 episodes putting some pretty stubborn misconceptions on trial. And if there's one thread that runs through all of them, I think it's this. Curiosity serves us a lot better than certainty does. And here's what I mean. The moment we think we already know what autism looks like, or sounds like, or acts like, we stop paying attention to the actual person that's right in front of us. And that person almost always has more to teach us than our assumptions do. So the next time you find yourself thinking, they don't seem autistic to me, I just invite you to sit with that thought for a second because, or before you finish it, because you might be right, or you might be overlooking someone who's been hiding in plain sight their whole life. Okay, thanks for spending this series with me. If this episode made you think differently about someone in your life, I'd love to hear about it. And if you know someone who could use a little more nuance in how they think about autism, this would be a good podcast episode to send their way. Have a great rest of the week and don't ever forget that your uniqueness is awesome.